Greetings, one and all! So let's wrap up our examination of the Hobbit trilogy. Now I've picked apart both the good and the bad of the previous two films, so if you haven't seen those, you might want to check them out first. I also have to use just stills in these videos, because YouTube will hit me with copyright claims if I don't. I know, fair use just doesn't exist anymore, it would seem. But moving on from that, the popular opinion of these films has been far more negative than they deserve, but does that hold true for this movie as well? I'm also going to be covering the theatrical cut of the film, not the extended edition. The reason for this is that more people have seen the former, and thus they'll be more familiar with it. Now, let's get into it. We open up with an establishing shot of Lake Town with an alarm bell ringing. This is interesting, as the populace seem to be largely ignoring or unaware of the dragon's approach at the end of the previous film, but maybe the alarm has only just begun sounding. It's then shown that the master is loading his valuables onto a boat and trying to escape. One of his guards even asks if they shouldn't try to do anything to save the town, but he dismisses it as lost. He is also shown to be backtracking on his prior stance, claiming that he was against helping the dwarves, when in reality he deliberately helped them to side against Bard. In the book, the Master was a very minor character, having very few lines, and indeed running away with as much gold as he could carry before dying in the wilderness. This adaptation of him is given much more screen time, and while it's mostly accurate to his character, I personally find him to be rather annoying. Back at Bard's home, Tauriel is attempting to get the remaining dwarves and Bard's children to flee, but Bane refuses to leave his now imprisoned dad behind. The elf counters by telling him that if they stay, then his sisters will die, and asks him if that's what his father would want. Yes, Tauriel is a creation of the films. We've all heard that argument 1,000 times over. The romance with Keely is incredibly rushed, we know that too. But this is a nice character moment for her. Think about it. Elves don't die of old age. Members of other races would be born, live, and die at an increasing rate according to an elf's perception of time. That's why it's such a strong moment of character for her to show compassion to these people. It would be easy to disregard them, saying that they'll just die anyway, but that's not what Tauriel does. She's not portrayed in a Mary Sue way either. She's just doing what she can to help. This moment was well done. Back at the jail, Bard's guards have fled the scene without releasing him. A+ for the justice system of Lake Town there. Smaug then makes his arrival, and he passes over the town before he begins breathing fire. I like to think that he did that to let the people know that he had arrived before he did anything. Instill terror before blasting them. It fits his character. As the Master tries to make his escape, he actually laments that they can't take any of the people with them. I mean, you probably could if you ditched the gold, but what do I know? He then backtracks by saying, "They're hardly," but Alfred finishes the statement of "worth it." Now, Alfred was also a creation for these films, and I'm much less forgiving about him. While Tauriel contributes to these movies despite her forced and rushed romance, Alfred exists only to be a nuisance. He simply serves as an extension of the Master, persisting even after the latter's demise, but we'll get into that in a bit. The Master's boat sideswipes and nearly capsizes the dwarves' boat, and the Master screams as some of his treasure falls overboard. Alfred declares that they're carrying too much weight to go any faster, and in response, the Master shoves Alfred overboard. Bard has managed to acquire some rope from somewhere, and ties one end into a loop and throws it from his cell window. What his plan was, I can only guess. Perhaps he was deliberately trying to snag a passing boat. This loop then comically ensnares the Master, and as he's pulled along by the boat, the rope goes taut, and then it breaks apart the wall of his cell. Man, that wood must have been pretty rotten to break apart that easily. Bard then breaks into an armory and retrieves a bow. The Desolation of Smaug established that a ballista was needed to hurt a dragon in these films, so it's a bit odd that the movie would make this such an important moment. Bard did kill Smaug with his bow in the book, though, so I'm a bit at odds. Bard then begins to make his way across the rooftops towards the bell tower, which is somehow ringing without anyone manning it. Back outside Erebor, Bilbo and the dwarves watch hopelessly as Esgaroth burns. We even see how this hits Balin the hardest, because he lived through having his home taken by Smaug, and now they've inadvertently caused him to destroy these innocent people. Can you imagine how badly that would tear you up inside? Even if they tried to get back to Lake Town, they'd never be able to make it in time to do anything. And even if they could, what would they do? It's a hopeless scenario. The only one not affected is Thorin. Bilbo watches him simply staring hungrily at Erebor. Now is when the dragon sickness of the past movie really gets amped up to 11. Thorin from Unexpected Journey would never have acted so callously towards the death of innocents, even if he didn't like them. Now, though, he's been taken over. Bard has now made his way to the bell tower and looses an arrow at Smaug, which the dragon doesn't even seem to notice. The dwarves and Bard's children then catch sight of the man loosing arrows at Smaug, and you can really feel the emotion behind the score used here. Bard is trying to protect his family, who he knows must be somewhere out there. That's the responsibility of a father. He's not trying to run away or save himself. He's directly trying to kill the threat or draw it to himself, showing just what sort of man he is. Keely exclaims that Bard did hit Smaug's weak spot, but Tauriel tells him that Bard's arrows won't be enough to penetrate the dragon's hide. Bane then sees the boat where he stashed the ballista bolt. No, I won't call a bolt an arrow, no matter what the movie calls it, and jumps from their craft to reach it. The dwarves try to stop him, but it's already too late. Tauriel tells them to leave him, as they can't turn back. This might seem harsh, but in a survival situation, you have to think about saving the most people. If you turn around for one, then everyone will likely die instead of just one individual. Bard looses his last arrow, which glances off Smaug's scales, dealing no damage. Bard visibly wilts at this, and you can feel like even though he knew that the arrows wouldn't do anything, they were all he had to try and stop Smaug. At least that was something he could do. Now, he has nothing. Bane then reaches the top of the ladder and calls out to his father, and Bard actually panics now, as he was trying to distract Smaug so that his family could escape. He even exclaims, "You were supposed to leave!" Clearly, he was fine with his own death, as long as it meant that his children could get away. Bane then shows his dad that he retrieved the bolt, and hope returns to Bard. The arrows didn't have the mass to hurt Smaug, but now he has a shot, literally, of actually doing something. It's just one shot, but it's more than what he had before. Smaug's had enough fun, though, and heavily damages the tower in a flyby, nearly knocking Bane off. The dragon then turns and speaks directly to Bard, showing that he was aware of the arrows the whole time. He demands to know who he is that would stand against him, as everyone else fled for their lives. Bard tries to retrieve his bow, only to find that it's been snapped in half. Granted, you'd never be able to loose an entire ballista bolt from a bow, but it is what it is, I suppose. Smaug delights in this, relishing in Bard's helplessness. Benedict Cumberbatch really brings Smaug to life in these films. Casting has always been a strong suit in these films and the original trilogy. But Smaug makes the mistake of trying to taunt a father by threatening his child. Bard improvises by jamming the two halves of the bow into the tower's remaining support beams to use as a method of shooting the arrow. I have to say, that isn't how a bow works. It isn't the string's elasticity that launches the arrow, it's the bow's limbs being bent, then springing back into their original position. The string is what enables that. This setup wouldn't accomplish much. Working together as father and son, Bard balances the bolt on Bane's shoulder to take aim, and we get great characterization for Bard, Bane, and Smaug. Smaug's fatal flaw is on full display here, believing that Bard has no chance of stopping him. He wants the one person who stood up to him to know that he's helpless, and he relishes it. Bane is still just a kid. A brave kid, but a kid nonetheless. He's scared, and for good reason. The last great dragon of Middle-earth is slowly closing in on him. Of course he'd be scared. But like a good dad, Bard keeps him distracted from Smaug by telling his son to focus on him. Bard releases the bolt, which strikes true and pierces Smaug's heart. The dragon has a final death lunge, which topples the tower and sends Bard and Bane into the lake below. Smaug attempts in vain to take flight again, but a heart injury says otherwise. Smaug's corpse then lands on the Master's boat, killing him along with his men and sending his gold to the bottom of the lake. Bilbo and the dwarves see Smaug's death and rejoice, but Thorin realizes that without a dragon guarding Erebor, others will come to plunder its riches, and there are too few of them to stop any intruders. Gandalf is still held captive in Dual-Wielder though, and he hears Galadriel's voice in his head, telling him that he's not alone. The scene is brief, however, as we cut back to the remnants of Lake Town in the morning following Smaug's demise. The townsfolk are still trying to find their survivors and any belongings in the lake, and Bard's children are frantically calling out for him. Alfred is unfortunately featured prominently, screaming for absolutely zero reason, which detracts from an otherwise important sequence. The dwarves make ready to shove off in a scavenged boat, but Keely pleads Tauriel to come with him. I've said it before, but this is rushed to an absurd extent. Do I believe that this could have worked? Yes. It wasn't given the time it needed, though. People like to bring up how it's not lore-friendly, which it isn't, but I've always found it strange how elves, dwarves, and men, capital M, as in the race, never developed more intimate bonds with each other, romantic or otherwise. They're all completely sapient, so why wasn't it a thing outside of Arwen and Aragorn, and Beren and Luthien? The moment is cut off, however, by the return of Legolas. He's clearly agitated, but he keeps his cool, telling Tauriel that they're needed elsewhere. Though he spoke in Elvish, Keely seems to get the gist of what he said, and moves off sullenly to join his companions, though not before giving Tauriel his token from the last film. The next sequence shows a woman of the town passing out dry clothes to the other survivors, but Alfred then tries to snatch some from her. He threatens the woman when she won't comply, but he's stopped by Bard. One of the townsfolk then declares that he saw Bard kill Smaug, and the survivors cheer and praise him. From the look on his face, he doesn't seem to know how to react to this. I mean, it's a bit of an unexpected situation, isn't it? He was doing this for his children, not for glory. Not only that, but he was just imprisoned and made to look like a fool by the Master. Needless to say, this is probably not what he had planned for. Alfred then tries to squeeze his way into Bard's good graces by declaring him the Dragon Slayer and King Bard. But Bard isn't having any of it. Bard then demands to know where the Master is, and someone says something rather strange. A woman declares that he's halfway down the Anduin with all our coin. There's a bit of a problem there. Lake Town doesn't connect to the Anduin. It sits on the river Running, which doesn't connect to the Anduin. That's a bit of a strange oversight, given all that happens in these movies and The Lord of the Rings. The people then decide to take their vengeance on Alfred for everything the Master, and by extension, he did, but Bard stops them. While some, myself included, would say that Alfred deserves to die, letting the survivors escalate into an enraged mob won't be good for anyone. If you let them off him then and there in a rage, then there's no telling what they might do. They're desperate, and with few resources after their town's destruction, and things could get ugly fast. By all means end Alfred, but not just yet. Not in this state of mind. Bard rightfully declares that they need to gather all the resources they can from the wreckage and then find shelter. Given that these people are now leaderless and scared, combined with Bard's slaying of Smaug, they naturally follow him. Fili, Keely, Oin, and Bofur then trek for miles to reach Erebor, and began to panic when they see the ruined front gates. Imagine having to hike for miles upon miles, not knowing if your friends are alive or dead after Smaug decided to show up, only to be met with nothing. Scary stuff, that. As they proceed, they're met by a frantic Bilbo, who tells them that they all need to leave. He explains that Thorin has been acting strangely, not sleeping and barely eating, and that this place has done something to him. Keely, Bofur, and Oin listen intently to Bilbo, but Feely is distracted by the glow of the treasure further in, and wanders off to investigate, prompting the others to follow. As they gaze upon the riches, though, Thorin appears, now wearing an ornate cloak and rambling to himself about the wealth. As he takes notice of the newcomers, they can clearly see that he's not acting in his right mind, and are taken aback by it. The four then move off to rejoin with their fellows, but Thorin quickly puts them back to work looking for the Arkenstone. Now he barks out outrageous orders, saying things like, "No one rests until it is found." The normal Thorin would never treat his people like this, and Bilbo is horrified by what's happening. We never really got a good look at how much the gold affected Thorin in the book, because the pace was so quick. As I said before, The Hobbit doesn't read like any of Tolkien's other works. So while we can't say for certain how much, if at all, he was affected by it, the films do let us see that he's lost it more and more the closer he got to the treasure. In Unexpected Journey, while he was gruff or hostile to anyone not already in his good graces, he wouldn't set harsh demands of his people or threaten anyone. His mental state gradually slipped over the course of the last movie, and now he's completely different. Bilbo moves to the Outer Wall though, and it's revealed that he actually did manage to snatch the Arkenstone as he fled from Smaug. He's been keeping it this whole time, afraid of not only what it's already done to Thorin, but what might happen if he gets it. Real friends always look out for you, even when it's not what you want. Back at the wreckage of Lake Town, Bard instructs his people to take only what they need, as they will have to hike for miles to reach Erebor. Alfred tries to suck up to Bard, saying that all the gold inside will be theirs, but again, Bard shoots him down. He says that any gold inside is cursed, and that they'll only take what they need to rebuild. Legolas tells him, however, that the news of Smaug's death will spread, and that others will look to take Erebor for their own, either for its riches or its location. But we finally get to see what became of his pursuit of Bolg at the end of the last film. He returns to his father, Azog, who is at the head of Sauron's army. Bolg informs him that they were attacked by elves, and Azog points his arm blade at him. The difference between father-son relationships amongst humans and orcs is quite stark, it would seem. Azog then berates his son and tells him to bring reinforcements from Gundabad. That's quite a hike. Azog then rallies his troops by promising them elves, men, and dwarves to kill as they resume their march. But we get the actual account of what happened from Legolas. Orcs aren't reliable sources. Yeah, I said it. Cancel me. I dare you. Apparently, wargs cut off the chase of Bolg, and they bore Gundabad's mark. Not surprising, seeing as orcs and dwarves have fought over it for centuries. But another of Thranduil's elves arrives on the scene and tells Legolas that his father has ordered him to return, and that Tauriel has been banished. Legolas says that he's not going. Good on you. And that he's going to Gundabad, asking Tauriel to join him. Again, that's a long way. And what exactly are you hoping to accomplish there? It's been held by the orcs for centuries. Even the dwarves haven't been able to take it from them for any great length of time. Back in Dol Guldur, Gandalf, weak and delirious from exposure and lack of food and water in the cage, is speaking to himself, and we see shots of Radagast speaking as well, implying that they are communicating. A lone orc has decided that he wants to kill Gandalf though, and as he's about to do so, Galadriel arrives and vaporizes it. Given that she wears one of the 3 elven rings, and is powerful in her own right, a single orc has no chance against her. As she tries to carry Gandalf to safety though, she's waylaid by the Nazgul, seen in their wraith forms without their robes. Now I know that nothing can be confirmed here, but we only know the identity of one of the Nazgul. Khamûl the Easterling was the second most powerful Nazgul, right behind the Witch King, and one of these Nazgul wears armor very reminiscent of the armor that the Easterlings wore in the original movies. It's a nice detail for observant viewers. Elrond and Saruman then show themselves, and a fight breaks out between them and the Nazgul. Subjectively, I absolutely love this scene. Seeing the Nazgul get a great showing like this on top of a location only mentioned in the appendices makes me positively giddy. However, there is the question of whether Elrond and Saruman should be able to see the ring wraiths in the Wraith world. Saruman, like Gandalf and Radagast, is a Maiar spirit, and thus exists in both the seen and unseen worlds. However, the wizards don't have access to most of their power, and Gandalf doesn't seem to be able to see someone who puts on the One Ring, which transports the user mostly into the unseen world. Elrond is not a high elf, having never been to Valinor. One could make the argument that because of his lineage, he might be able to see the ring wraiths, but nothing about that is confirmed one way or the other. Radagast has managed to drag his rabbit sled in here though, and Galadriel tells him to get Gandalf out, as Sauron has weakened him to the point where the evil of this place is killing him. Gandalf implores her to escape with him, but she refuses. Given her history outside of the films, a being from Valinor trying to offer her mercy means a great deal. Despite Elrond and Saruman's efforts though, the Nazgul can't be truly stopped. Not as long as the One Ring exists. I also have to question how they weren't exposed to the black breath of the Nazgul, which severely cripples and often kills anyone who directly strikes them. If you were wondering why Éowyn and Merry act like they were hurt when they took down the Witch King, that's why. But Sauron himself enters the scene, and he threatens the return of Angmar. For those not aware, Angmar was what the Witch King got up to after Sauron was defeated in the Second Age, and it took down Arnor, Gondor's brother kingdom. Galadriel, however, is able to banish Sauron. With the ring, Sauron's power was much greater than before he created it. Without it, though, he is much weaker. The wizards are also handicapped in terms of their strength, but Galadriel, despite being an elf, has no restrictions on her power. But then Saruman declares that he'll deal with Sauron, which, as we all know, is garbage. He wants the ring for himself, and he hopes that Sauron will do most of the legwork in finding it so that he can swoop in and take it for himself. As morning sets in, Gandalf tells Radagast that he needs a horse. He insists that he has to warn the dwarves that Sauron's armies are coming. Credit to you, dude. You just got your rear end handed to you by Sauron, then hung in a cage with no food or water and left to the elements, and you already want to get back into it. In Erebor, Thorin's mental state is still deteriorating. He demands that the Arkenstone be found, to which Dwalin reports that they've been searching and still can't find it. Balin then asks him if he doubts the loyalty of any of them, to which he retorts that if anyone has found it, but hasn't given it to him, he'll be avenged. Again, not something Thorin would normally do. Bilbo then follows Balin, who is holding back tears, declaring that Thorin does indeed have dragon sickness. He recounts that it drove Thror mad, and it's now doing the same to Thorin. Bilbo then asks him, clearly trying to not give anything away, that if Thorin got the Arkenstone, would it help him? It's unclear if Balin is picking up on this, but he tells Bilbo that the Arkenstone is the pinnacle of the wealth here, and that if Thorin did get it, things would get worse. Bilbo then moves to sit outside in the hall, and examines something he draws from inside his coat. We can't see it, as it's off camera, but a paranoid Thorin demands to know what Bilbo's holding. The music rises, increasing the tension, and Bilbo declares that it's nothing. We're meant to think that what he was examining was the Arkenstone, but in reality, it was a simple acorn that he had taken from Beorn's garden. Bilbo tells Thorin that he wants to plant it in his own garden at Bag End, and Thorin seems to break free of the dragon sickness for just a moment, as Bilbo explains why he took it. He tells Thorin that it'll grow, and that it'll remind him of everything that happened on this journey, both the good and the bad. He doesn't say it, but the implication is clear that the memories and bonds formed are worth more than the material goods. This almost gets through to Thorin. Almost. Unfortunately, he's snapped right back when Dwalin arrives to tell him that the survivors of Lake Town have arrived in Dale. If Bilbo had had maybe 10 minutes, he could have helped Thorin. But now that strangers have showed up, the dragon sickness rears its ugly head in full force again. Bard then sees that Thorin and his company survived, and Alfred objects to them being between them and the gold. Bard, however, doesn't care about that. Gold won't feed them or keep them warm as winter approaches. Not in their current situation anyway. Not until they have someone who will give them what they need for it. Bard then calls for the people to begin finding shelter for the night in the ruins and to get fires started. To his credit, he tries multiple times to give Alfred a chance to make something of himself, but at every turn, Alfred just refuses to improve. I've seen the type, and I'm sure you have too. You eventually realize that they won't change their ways, so you just have to move on. But the dwarves have set to work barricading the broken gates on Thorin's orders. Keely objects for a moment, saying that the people of Lake Town have lost everything, but Thorin won't hear any of it. He declares that they have much to be grateful for, and from the sound of it, this seems to be something that was said to him at one point. In his dragon sickness, he's remembering how his people received no help after they lost everything, and so he in turn won't help anyone else now that they've lost everything. The problem being is that these are not the same people who turned you away before. This is how cycles of violence spread, people. The next morning, the people bring to Bard's attention that they don't have enough food for everyone, to which he declares that the children, wounded, and women come first. That's a nice sentiment, and I can see where you're coming from, but if the men are going to have to hunt for more food, they'll need their strength. A weak hunter won't catch much. But Thranduil has brought his forces here, and despite his arrogance and dismissal of everyone who isn't his, he did bring provisions specifically for these refugees. This shows us that there's more nuance to him than previously thought. He still prioritizes his own kingdom, but he can help others if it doesn't cost him anything. He even says that he doesn't care about their gratitude, but that he came here to reclaim something of his. And that's why you brought food for these people. If you were an anime girl, you'd be as tsundere as it's possible to be. But Bard pleads for Thranduil to let him speak with Thorin first, so that they can avoid conflict. A remarkably sound take. Bard approaches the gates and asks Thorin to speak with him. As Bard approaches further, a messenger bird departs the mountain, which will become important later. Bard asks that Thorin keep his word and give the people of Lake Town a share of the gold so that they can rebuild. But Thorin counters that he won't give up anything while armed elves sit outside his gates. Bard tries to warn him that the elves will attack if they can't strike a bargain, but Thorin interprets this as a threat. The discussion rapidly shifts into an argument though, with Bard telling Thorin that the people of Lake Town helped them and in return lost everything. But Thorin declares that they only made that deal because they had nothing left. I can see where both sides are coming from, but Thorin, your actions cost these innocent people their homes and livelihoods. You could take half the gold from Erebor and still have more than you'd know what to do with. We also get to see how a real king is supposed to act, but not from Thorin, the king under the mountain. Thorin demands to know why he should keep his end of the bargain, to which Bard asks if his word means nothing. Take note, someone is only worth as much as their word. Someone who goes back on what they say they'll do isn't worth much at all. Bard is the one acting much more like a king, despite not being one, trying to make peace instead of war, and honoring his word. Thorin, while being a rightful king, is not acting like how one should. He's reneging on his word, and acting like a coward, hiding in the mountain and leading his small band into a fight that they can't possibly win. Not the real Thorin, but Thorin with dragon sickness. Bilbo calls him out on this, saying that they're outnumbered several hundred to 14. Thorin tells him that that won't be the case for much longer, letting us know that he's sent for reinforcements with that bird. Bard then expresses his frustration and bewilderment to Thranduil, but the elf is hardly more reasonable than Thorin. He declares that his forces will move on the mountain at dawn, and we see both sides preparing. The humans gather the weapons still in Dale, and the dwarves still have plenty of arms and armor within Erebor. But again, we get to see that Thorin's still there underneath the dragon sickness. This is when he gives Bilbo the mithril shirt that will become immeasurably important for Frodo later. Thorin still cares about his friend, even if he's not in his right mind. That said, he shortly begins raving to Bilbo. In his mania, he declares that he believes one of the company is keeping the Arkenstone from him, despite the other dwarves having no reason to do so. The audio is layered to make his words seem reminiscent of both Smaug and Gollum, saying that the gold is his and that he won't be separated from it. Legolas and Tauriel have made their way to the mountain of Gundabad, though, and are spying on it from a distance. Legolas reports that his mother died in the war against Angmar, the orcs using this place as a fortress at the time. But we have no information on who his mother was. So this is an invention of the films, but Legolas tells Tauriel that his father won't speak about it, implying that her death is what led him to being so reclusive and hostile. Is that canon? No. But in the events of these films, it's part of what makes Thranduil who he is. Legolas also mentions that they should move under the cover of night. Orcs actually see better at night than they do in the sun, so that would realistically make it more difficult for you rather than easier. Gandalf has now made his way to Dale, and after a brief encounter with Alfred, of which there isn't much to note, he urges Thranduil and Bard to cease their plans for Erebor and instead prepare to fight the orcs. Thranduil, of course, doesn't believe him. There's a reason that he's not counted among the great elf lords like Galadriel and Elrond. But Gandalf urges the two commanders that Sauron wants to seize Erebor not only for its riches, but its location. Did you ever watch The Lord of the Rings and wonder why you never saw an army of dwarves anywhere? Well, that's because they were being attacked here by a massive army of Easterlings. Yeah, Sauron was so concerned with the dwarves and this location that he sent forces here to ensure that they couldn't help anywhere else. If he had taken Erebor, he'd have had a staging ground for attacks against the north of Middle-earth, and the treasure here would be enticing to the Easterlings and Haradrim following him. So I'm a big fan of how these films included this story into the grand structure of the main trilogy. What I'm less a fan of is the method of Azog moving his armies. A short scene shows us that they are moving underground, using wereworms to create tunnels. We don't even know if these creatures existed, because they're referenced all of one time in the books, where Bilbo also refers to a place that doesn't exist. But I'll say more on these things when the time comes. Back at Gundabad, Legolas and Tauriel witness Bolg make his appearance, and a second force of orcs issues forth from Gundabad. I will say that it's a nice touch that the orcs are using the black speech more in these films than in The Lord of the Rings. For those not aware, Sauron originally wanted the orcs to all speak the black speech that he created, but after his fall, their infighting led them to all butcher the language to the point where it was unrecognizable to other tribes, so they all had to use the common tongue with each other. These orcs all follow Azog, so it makes sense that they'd all be using the same form of the language. It's a nice little touch that most probably wouldn't notice, but I appreciate it. But Thranduil is still being the self-absorbed idiot that he is, and completely disregards Gandalf. Bilbo has his own plans though. He sneaks down from the gate at night, and sneaks into Dale to find Gandalf and Bard. Bilbo gives Thranduil and Bard the Arkenstone so that they may use it as leverage against Thorin. It's tearing Bilbo apart inside to see what this treasure is doing to his friend, and he knows that they can't hold out against Thranduil's forces. So, acting like a real friend, he knows that Thorin will pay any price for the Arkenstone. and that can help them avoid conflict entirely, even though Thorin will hate him for it. Bilbo says as much. He says that he's not doing it for Bard and their forces, but he's doing it to avoid the need for war. Gandalf then tells Bilbo that he needs to leave the next morning, but Bilbo won't leave his friends. The wizard then tells him that treasure that a dragon has sat on can corrupt those who desire it, further cementing that Thorin isn't in his right mind. I'm not too much a fan of the dragon sickness. It dials up Thorin's bad qualities to 11, and is inconsistent in whom it affects. It effectively removes a good chunk of Thorin's agency, seeing as he's losing his mind. I like to think that in the books, if the elves that imprisoned him hadn't shown up, Thorin would have helped the people of Lake Town. But that's just conjecture. Here, he's depicted as going back on his word before they even arrive. Again, this isn't confirmed anywhere, but seeing as Thorin was never one to go back on his word before, I don't believe that he'd be so heartless as to turn away the people of Esgaroth. The following morning, the armies have been gathered, and Thranduil and Bard make to sue for peace, showing him the Arkenstone. Thorin is clearly distressed, claiming that it's a fake, even though up until this point, all the dwarves had agreed that nothing looks like the Arkenstone. Bilbo then chimes in, telling Thorin that he did, in fact, give the Arkenstone to their enemies. He cites that he did this because Thorin has been changed by the dragon sickness, and that the Thorin he knew would never behave like this. But Bilbo's changed too. The Bilbo of Bag End would never raise his voice or stand up so strongly about something. He's changed for the better, while Thorin has been affected for the worse. But remember what Bilbo said about the dwarves being loyal to a fault? Well, now they're conflicted. Thorin demands that Bilbo be thrown over the wall, but none of them are sure what to do. They were loyal to Thorin from the beginning, but Bilbo also earned their loyalty. They don't know what to do. They even try to stop Thorin when he tries to do it himself. While no grand spectacle is made of it, this shows us just how much Bilbo has earned their trust and respect. They're willing to go against their king to ensure that he isn't hurt. And people say that there was no character development in these films. Gandalf then intervenes, commanding Thorin to let Bilbo go. While he's distracted, Bofur, who's always been the friendliest towards Bilbo, helps him away and urges him to go. The dwarves can see why Bilbo did what he did. They're not stupid, but they also can't bring themselves to turn against Thorin. What even could they do? They're in a lose-lose situation. But the raven Thorin had sent out earlier returns, and with it comes Dane's force of dwarves from the Iron Hills. I have to say, I find Dane's great to watch. He shows just how gruff dwarves can be when they're angered, and reminds me of a good friend of mine. A strange thing to note is that in the lore, Dane had a red axe, while in this movie, he has a hammer, but it's also red. It's a strange little departure, like how the movies increased the number of orcs that Legolas and Gimli killed at the Hornburg by 1 each. Gandalf tries to convince Dane to stand down, but Dane's so focused on Thranduil that I'm not even sure he was paying Gandalf any attention. He barely even looks at the wizard. Now, while I'm not covering the extended editions, I will say that the theatrical cut and it depart drastically here. In the theater release, the orcs arrive before the situation escalates any further, in keeping with the book. In the extended edition, the dwarves and elves actually begin killing each other first. I'm so conflicted. Yes, the theatrical cut is more accurate, but the extended battle scenes are a treat to watch, especially the sequences with the dwarves. But remember what I said about the wereworms? Well, here they are in all their grotesque glory. They open up tunnels in the rock, and the orcs come pouring forth. Question: if the mountain was their goal, why didn't they just tunnel into it and take it right then and there? They'd have a fortress to stage their attack against the rather small force of elves, men, and dwarves. But I do like how the dwarves immediately forget about the elves once the orcs arrive. They completely stop dealing with them when an objectively evil force shows up, and take up a position reminiscent of a Roman testudo formation. But Thorin denies any of his company permission to join the battle, having jumped full on into dragon sickness and letting Dane fight for him, just as Thror didn't fight when Smaug arrived. I will say though, there's a bit of an oversight in that half of the dwarven forces don't move when the orcs show up. They just stand there stationary for some reason. But the elves don't move at all, and it's played for tension whether or not they'll help the dwarves. At the last minute though, they do join in the battle, jumping over the dwarves to attack the orcs. While it looks cool, that completely nullifies the formation. Then on top of that, the dwarves then level their spears and charge, which would have also skewered the elves in the process, but somehow that doesn't happen. Subjectively, it looks cool. Objectively, that is a genuinely terrible move that would have resulted in the elves all getting killed. What they should have done is loosed arrows over the dwarves to hit the orcs' rear guard and sent their forces to strengthen the dwarves' flank. That way they'd simultaneously be attacking and moving to bolster their newly combined forces. Azog is also shown to be commanding his forces from Ravenhill, using flags and horn signals to direct them. It's an inspired bit, and separates him from the mindless slavering orcs we've seen before. He orders a portion of his forces to take Dale, which is only occupied by non-combatants. Bard and Gandalf then have the human forces fall back to the ruins, Bilbo in tow. We do get to see Bard immediately take control of the situation, ordering the archers into an advantageous position, but he then moves to take all of his forces to save his children. It's a bit of a conflicting thing here. The most important thing to Bard is his family, but without knowing the full breadth of the situation, is taking the rest of his forces to try and save his children the most tactically sound decision. If that area's been overrun, as the fleeing man said, then they could just be walking into a death trap without any way to even save his kids. We do get to see that even Bane gets a good showing here, and the writers even included ogres in this battle, creatures that were only mentioned in passing a handful of times that might not have even really existed, but they do give a nice middle ground between orcs and trolls, so I'm willing to allow their inclusion. Again, we get more of Alfred's garbage, with him sprinting into the Great Hall where they're gathering the non-combatants, and honestly the movie would be better without him. He adds nothing of note. I'm not faulting the actor's performance, as the actors of a film don't get much of a say in how their character acts most of the time. But Thranduil then decides to lead his forces into the city as well, leaving the dwarves alone on the field. We can see that the dwarves are greatly outnumbered, and Dane questions where Thorin is. As comical as his headbutting of the orcs is, that can be a great move in a fistfight. Not many people expect it. Dwalin then confronts Thorin, who is simply sitting on his throne, like his grandfather did before him. He declares that the gold is worth more than the lives of the troops he summoned, and is willing to let them die. This is why I don't like the dragon sickness inclusion. This isn't Thorin. Dwalin, who's always been the closest to Thorin, with maybe the exception of Balin, then says that Thorin is lesser than he's ever been, even when they were homeless. This almost seems to get through to Thorin, as he refers to himself as someone other than Thorin Oakenshield, and he demands that Dwalin leaves before he kills him. Now this can be interpreted one of two ways. Either Thorin is simply threatening his friend's life, or he's begging him to leave before the dragon sickness makes him do so. It's never confirmed which one it is, but the dialogue makes me more inclined to believe the second option. Thorin then wanders across the golden floor where they had tried to kill Smaug in the previous film, hearing in his head what everyone has said about how he's changed. The interesting part is what happens next. Thorin hallucinates himself sinking into the gold, and hears Gandalf tell him that this treasure will be his death. All of the other lines he heard to himself were said to him at one point or another, except for this one. This makes me question if Gandalf is somehow influencing him, as that wasn't a line said to him at any previous point. Thorin then flings the crown from his head and stands back in shock of what he's become. He then moves to join the other dwarves at the gate, most of whom have removed their armor for some reason. There is a battle going on just outside. Keep the armor on. Keely then objects once again to hiding away, and now Thorin agrees, asking if the others will follow him once again. But why would you get rid of the armor you were previously wearing if you're going out there now? I get that the production team likely wanted to make more of a visual distinction of Thorin with dragon sickness versus without, but you could have just had him get rid of the cloak. Armor saves lives, people. Keep it on when you're going to war. The remaining dwarven forces have been backed up to the blocked gates, with no way out past Azog's forces. This is their last stand, and they know it. What follows is another moment that I'm torn on. Bombur sounds a massive horn, and Thorin's company break down the barricade with a bell that is somehow there, and charge through. The dwarves rally to the side of their king, and they began to drive the orcs back. Objectively, the sequence is flawed in that the dwarves are still greatly outnumbered. There's no getting around that. Subjectively, I love this scene. The score gives me goosebumps every time, and seeing the dwarves crush some orcs is always a highlight. That said, people always say, how can 13 more dwarves make a difference? And you're correct. 13 more soldiers won't make much of a difference against those odds, no matter how skilled they are. But there are two factors at play here. The first is morale. Morale, being your will to keep going, plays much more of a role than most people give it credit for. If you don't think you can win, you're not going to give it your all, be it in a fight or something more mundane. The arrival of their king would boost the dwarves' morale immensely, causing them to fight harder. The second factor is that Azog stops giving commands to his army once Thorin shows up. He's so focused on him that he lets everything else go to cinders because he gets tunnel vision, and without their orders, the orcs can't stand up to the other forces, as they're fighting as a mob, not a real army. But, as with every good moment in this film, Alfred has to show up again right after it. The women and the elderly then decide to take up arms and join the others in the fight, but Alfred, now dressed as a woman, tries to use this disguise to hide. He's found out and insulted, and decides to try and take some gold and run. Honestly, the sequence would have been so much better without him. Just have the women and elderly decide to join the fight on their own, and it would have helped the tone of the film so much more. But once again, the theatrical cut and the extended editions divide for a time. The theatrical version depicts Thorin telling Dane that he's going to kill Azog to completely deprive the orcs of their orders, while he mounts a ram that came from nowhere. The extended edition shows us that the dwarves brought rams as mounts for their cavalry, and shows battle wagons also pulled by them, which Fili, Kili, Balin, and Dwalin follow Thorin on. Now, don't quote me on this, but I believe that the extended scenes had to be cut because they featured heavy amounts of gore from the orcs, which would have driven the rating of the movie up. But regardless, Thorin and his three followers cut their way to Ravenhill, being glimpsed by Bilbo and Gandalf as they do so. But Legolas and Tauriel return, giving news to Gandalf that Bolg is on the way with more orcs. Gandalf deduces that these reinforcements will come from the north, in the direction of Ravenhill, where Thorin and the others currently are, and once they get there, they'll be doomed. At Ravenhill, Thorin orders Fili and Kili to scout the towers, but to not engage, while he and Dwalin deal with the remaining goblins. It's a good idea, so long as they decide to remain outside. Going into those ruins would drastically limit their escape routes if they're seen. Back in Dale, though, Thranduil elects to withdraw his forces after he sees the number of dead elves. Remember that Thranduil isn't a great and noble elf lord like Elrond and Galadriel. His kingdom of Mirkwood is small compared to Rivendell, Lothlorien, or the Grey Havens. Gandalf protests, but the Elven King won't be swayed. Bilbo then declares that he'll go to Ravenhill to warn Thorin. We do get to see how much Gandalf cares about Bilbo and the others, though. He forbids Bilbo from going, but Bilbo then tells him that he's not asking for permission. Gandalf's chief concern was that the orcs would see him and kill him, but Bilbo ensures the wizard that they won't. As he departs, he puts on the ring, making himself invisible to everyone. In the Wraith world, the orcs appear completely black, while the remaining elves appear white. This does make a degree of sense, as orcs were first created by Morgoth and have always been ensnared by evil. While there have been elves that have been not so good, shall we say, as a whole, they're much more inclined towards good. I'm reminded by how it never made much sense with a similar effect in the Harry Potter movies, where Death Eaters would wisp about as black smoke while good characters were white smoke. There wasn't anything there to determine those effects other than their relationship to the protagonist. Like, if someone was blackmailed, mind-controlled, or lied to into serving Voldemort, would they still show up as black even though they don't want to be there? It's just a comparison I thought of, but I digress. But Tauriel tries to block Thranduil's path, declaring that if he leaves, the dwarves will die. Thranduil counters that it doesn't matter, as they're mortal and will die anyway even if they survive today. Some people will say that's a trope. I'll respond by saying that Tolkien did it first. He created the things that everyone else copied and made into tropes. Tauriel then draws an arrow on him, decrying that their lives are worth just as much as an elf's. Again, I have to wonder why human-elf-dwarf friendships and romantic relations never happened more frequently. They're all completely capable of it, but it just never happened all that often. But Thranduil cleaves her bow in two, which is the disadvantage of ranged weapons. If your opponent can get closer than the end of your weapon, then even a firearm becomes useless. He declares that what Tauriel feels for Keely isn't real. I agree. While it isn't real yet, it could be in the future though. This romance plot between the two would have worked better if it had been portrayed as the start of a romance and not a complete romance. If they had just started to get to know one another, then it would have made much more sense. But Legolas, being a real Chad, steps in to tell his father that if he's going to kill her, then he'll have to kill him too. Even for someone as callous as Thranduil, having your own son say that he's willing to be killed by you to stop you must hit pretty hard. And it obviously does, as Thranduil crumbles while Legolas and Tauriel leave to make for Ravenhill. We then have a short scene, which is thankfully Alfred's final scene, where he is saved by Bard from an ogre. Alfred scoffs that Bard gave up the title of Master for his family, and then flees out of the scene and out of the film. Alfred served no role in these films. He wasn't needed for the plotline with the Master, and could easily have been omitted entirely. He only serves to drag the last two movies down, and his scenes are probably what most people would reference when calling these films outright bad. Bilbo then arrives at Ravenhill, and breathlessly tells Thorin that he has to escape. Thorin looks relieved to see Bilbo alive, and think about how bad he must feel after how he behaved. He must be torn up inside from how he was ready to attack the one person who was truly his friend. But Bilbo's news hits like a ton of bricks, and Thorin realizes that he's played right into Azog's hands. Or hand. He's missing one. But remember what I said about how entering the ruins was a bad idea? Well, Fili and Kili do exactly that. The two brothers separate inside, and Fili is captured and killed by Azog in full view of Thorin and the others. This is why I approve of some of the changes made in these films. While Fili was certainly given less screen time than Kili, it was still more attention than what the book gave him. All the two really did in the book was die off screen, so to speak. Was what they did perfect? No. But it gives us more of a connection to them at the very least. Kili charges off, looking to avenge the death of his brother, while Thorin and Dwalin race to try and stop him. Bilbo, however, is much slower to react. Think about it. The dwarves have all seen battle, at least to some extent, but Bilbo is just a plain hobbit. He's never seen someone he knows killed in front of him. He stumbles about in shock afterwards, and you can't really fault him. He has no experience or training for this sort of thing. But Azog cuts Thorin off, and the two begin their melee. Azog has killed Thorin's grandfather and nephew, and Thorin was responsible for handing the orc his only major defeat and taking his arm. Obviously, these two are not going to be buddy-buddy, but Bolg arrives ahead of his main force, with Sting even glowing at his approach. Bilbo is nearly killed by the orcs, but Dwalin arrives and saves him. It's unclear when or why he doubled back, but here he is. Legolas and Tauriel also arrive around this time, and while Legolas grabs onto one of the giant bats to get to the action faster, Tauriel panics as she sees Keely fighting alone against Azog's orcs. Bilbo engages in the Hobbit pastime of beaning orcs with rocks, but Bolg swiftly strikes him down with his mace, though he hits him with more or less the haft of the weapon. Honestly, Bolg probably thought he was a human child and was just smacking him down on the way to a real target. And this is essentially what happened in the book. Bilbo watched a small snippet of the battle before getting hit on the head with a rock and falling unconscious. We barely got to read any of the battle on page. And honestly, I'll take this. I know, tear me to shreds if you feel like it, but it never sat well with me that this battle was always talked about as such a huge deal in the books, but we barely got to see any of it. This movie isn't perfect, but I'll take an on-screen adaptation over completely missing the action. But Bolg moves off to engage Tauriel and Keely, whom he eventually bests. I have a problem with Keely's death. I still can't show footage because YouTube won't accept that this falls under fair use and will nuke me, but look at where Keely is. Bolg grabs him, and he just stays in this position until he's killed. He never tries to attack or break out of his grip. He just sits there, waiting to die. While a lot of the choreography in these movies is flashy but not practical stuff, I can let that slide if the characters still behave like they're in a life or death struggle. Keely doesn't do this. He just stays in that position. It's a really unfortunate slip-up that I wish hadn't happened, but happen it did. And so the romance between elf and dwarf is cut short. It was an interesting concept, but it was ham-fisted into the films without being given the time it needed to feel real. But Tauriel throws herself off of the tower with Bolg, and to save her, Legolas does the first of two things that many people try to throw up as a catch-all for why these films are bad. He causes a troll to collapse a tower, thus making a bridge from his location to hers. If you have a problem with that, then you should also have a problem with his killing a Mumuk in Return of the King, or his shield surfing in Two Towers. I know that some will say I'm using whataboutism, but I'd say that they're cherry-picking. If you have an issue with one, then you have to have an issue with all, or else you're a hypocrite. But that was only the first thing. We'll get to the second. Thorin has somehow broken his sword, and stabs its remaining length into an orc, who he then throws from the frozen lake towards Bolg, buying Legolas a breather. Legolas responds by throwing Orcrist into the orc that tries to kill Thorin, thus granting him a new weapon and the sword he used in the book. It should be glowing like Sting does, but oh well. Legolas then proceeds to use his daggers, which he always used in the Lord of the Rings films. Thorin then confronts Azog on the frozen river, and the orc smirks to himself at the arrival of Bolg's forces proper. He then faces Thorin, now using his arm blade and a massive flail, which is really just a giant brick with a chain attached. I love flails, I do, but you can't have them be this big. While the Witch King's flail was also oversized, proportionally it was much more in line with how a flail should be. Azog's is too long, and it shows. The longer the chain, the longer it takes the head to reach its target, and the longer your enemy has to react to it. But now comes the second thing that Legolas does that everyone parrots as to why these movies are bad. Bolg hurls a chunk of the tower at him, which causes it to crumble beneath him. Legolas then steps up the falling rocks to get back to attacking Bolg. Again we have cherry picking, but I'll set that aside. Let's examine this for a moment. Yes, it's lore time. For those not aware, the reason that elves are immortal in Tolkien's Legendarium is that their souls are connected to their bodies in a way that other races are not. This lets them accomplish feats of strength and agility that humans and dwarves can't. In Fellowship, you can see this same thing happens when Legolas walks on top of snow that all the other members have to wade through. It's the same deal here. I'd also love to see the detractors read the books, where Legolas and the other elves in Lothlorien can cross a river with nothing but a rope tied between two trees. The elves can run along the tightrope like it's a road, while everyone else needs additional ropes strung between the trees for them to hold on to. This is hardly a stretch from what's come before. Even giant YouTubers have brought this up like it alone causes the films to be bad, and I can only shake my head in disappointment. If you're going to criticize these films, Pick the parts that are actually bad. I love these movies, and I'll call out what's bad about them when I see them, but this isn't one of those things. But moving on, Bolg traps one of Legolas's daggers using the same technique that he used in the previous film, but Legolas counters this time by dual-wielding. This is why, if you're using a one-handed weapon, always have something in your other hand, be it another weapon or a shield. An empty hand is far less useful than either of those. Unfortunately, Bolg also just stands around like Keely did, which is a bit of a disappointment. Legolas's attack was slow, and he had plenty of time to try and stop it, but now he meets his end. Back to Thorin and Azog, the orcs' clumsy striking of the ice has left it cracking, making their footing even more unstable. Azog eventually gets his weapon stuck in the ice, and is distracted by Radagast arriving with the Eagles and Beorn. Seriously, Beorn got the short end of the stick. He was the one who killed Bolg in the book, but he only shows up for maybe 10 seconds in this movie. We barely get to see him fight. Pun intended. Thorin then steps off the ice and throws Azog's flail back at him, tipping over the ice and sending him into the river. Some will question how Thorin was able to dislodge the flail when Azog couldn't, but physics sometimes works in strange ways. I remember when I was a teenager at the gym with my dad, and someone had jerry-rigged some nonsensical contraption to have weights dangling from the bar at the end of the squat rack, making it so that we couldn't use it. We tried pulling on the stuff, but it wouldn't budge. I found a piece of chain with a hook on it that someone had left lying around, and for some reason, that let it just slide off without much effort at all. To this day, I still don't know why that worked, but it did. So, physics can be a little wonky at times. But Azog somehow holds his breath in the freezing water and manages to explode out from underneath it. This is much more ludicrous than anything Legolas did, and yet nobody calls this out. Freezing water will almost always cause your breath to leave you unless you've practiced being in it, and he had nothing to push off of underneath the ice to break through it. He stabs Thorin in the foot and overpowers him, bearing down with his arm blade while Thorin tries to block it, his blade catching it between its 2 points. Funny that I mentioned the gym, because Thorin's death was completely avoidable here. What Thorin does is remove his blade, getting stabbed by Azog in the process, then stabbing Azog in turn, killing him. What he should have done is what you're supposed to do when you can't lift the weight on the bench press. What you do is you relax one arm, which will cause the bar to drop in that direction. The plates will then slide off of that side because you're keeping the other end of the bar up with your other hand. Once the weights fall off of one side, the imbalance will cause the other end to dip, and then those plates will fall off too. Thorin should have relaxed his left arm and pushed off with his right, pivoting his body in the process. That would have caused Azog's blade to stab into the ice instead, giving him the perfect opportunity to stab Azog and get away with it, though Azog's armor does nothing to stop the blade for some reason. Thorin should have also kept his armor. Still, Thorin died in the book, and so he has to die here as well. Bilbo reawakens and says his iconic line of, "The Eagles are coming," before discovering the dying Thorin. Thorin also gets to keep his last lines from the book, apologizing to Bilbo for what he did, and saying that, "If more people valued home above gold, this world would be a merrier place." Every time, I can't help but feel somber at Thorin's death. Richard Armitage and Martin Freeman absolutely nailed their performances. Bilbo pleads with Thorin not to die, but it's over and he's gone. Again, Bilbo's never had to experience this before. He's just a hobbit, and hobbits never go through this. Thranduil then meets with Legolas, who tells him that he can't go back with him. I have to question how Legolas ended up at the Council of Elrond later then, but we don't have answers on that front. Thranduil then tells him to seek out a young Aragorn, but Aragorn would only be around 10 at this time, so yeah. His last words to his son are to tell him that his mother loved him. The Elven King then confronts Tauriel, who asks him why she feels so much pain over Keely's death, to which he responds, "Because it was real." All I can do is let out a sigh. Again, This would have worked much better if it had been portrayed as something starting between them and not a full-on romance. It wasn't real, but the potential for it could have been if the events had played out differently in a way that gave these two more time together. Alas, this is what we got. Tauriel gets no closure in this film, so I have to wonder where she is in the continuity of the original films. But I mean, the hopeful tone from Thranduil was nice. Maybe he'll change his ways because of this, but we'll never know. Gandalf then joins Bilbo, and there are no words that can be said at a time like this. After everything that's happened, the two just share a moment in silence. Remember, people, mourn your loved ones, but remember them how they were in life, not in death. Bilbo then makes ready to leave the dwarves, but he can't bring himself to say just what Thorin was to him. After everything that's happened, I can't blame him. Bilbo's never had a true friend before, even with the stain that the dragon sickness caused. Real friendships are born through hard times, where you see each other at your lowest points. Anything less is just an acquaintance. But Bilbo knows that his home is far from here, and he almost breaks down as he tells the dwarves that they're welcome any time at Bag End. The dwarves can't say anything, because what is there to say? This hobbit left everything he knew and cared about behind to help you reclaim your home after decades of drifting, and now you have it back, thanks in no small part to him. Words of gratitude just don't cut it in this instance. But Bilbo and Gandalf travel all the way back to the edge of the Shire, and Gandalf lets Bilbo know that he knows the Hobbit found a ring. Whether he believes that this was one of the 19, or one of the lesser ones that came before is unknown, but he certainly doesn't suspect that it was the one, not Sauron's ring. That'd be crazy, right? Bilbo's shocked, but he bids the wizard a fond farewell. And so Gandalf too departs the film, the last we'll ever see of the real Gandalf. I don't care what anyone says, Sir Ian McKellen is the only Gandalf, end of story. The final scenes show Bilbo taking Bag End back from the Sackville Bagginses, trying to take his spoons and all, just like the book. When the hobbits demand to know where he was and who Thorin is, Bilbo can finally declare that he was his friend. But amidst the empty and plundered Bag End, Bilbo still has the one possession that has a hold on him more than anything else. The One Ring. He doesn't know it yet, but it's worming its way into his head, just like it did for Gollum. But that's a story for the original films. But we do get a cut back to Fellowship Bilbo, whose face lights up at Gandalf's arrival. And on that note, the movie ends. This truly is a bittersweet ending. It gets me every time. I won't deny that these films are not as good as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but the general public grossly undersells them. So on to the scoring. Objectively, I'd give this a 5. There aren't so many huge and glaring flaws in the writing, but it's more of a death by 1,000 cuts sort of thing. 5 still isn't bad though. Unlike what IGN would say, a 5 is a middle-of-the-road score, as evidenced by the fact that it's in the middle. Some wonky choreography, the janky romance, the geography being condensed, and Alfred really hurt the score. Believe me, I wanted to give it a higher score, but there's just too many instances of things being off that stop me from doing so. Subjectively though, I give this an 8. I have fun with this movie every time I watch it, and the emotional beats for the most part hit each time. The score is phenomenal, and the acting is superb. It's just a fun, engaging movie that is unfortunately swarmed with detractors. This was the last mostly good thing we've gotten from Tolkien's adaptations, and with the rights no longer being held under such close supervision, I'm afraid that we won't be seeing much more for a very long time. With Rings of Power being deliberately bad, and Gollum being genuinely terrible, it leaves me with a hollow pit in my stomach. But you can check out War in the North. That game was great and mostly lore-friendly. I even did a video on it. Lord of the Rings Conquest was also a fun game that I plan to do a video on in the future as well. But this concludes my analysis of the Hobbit trilogy. My very first video was on an unexpected journey, and I can't help but cringe at the sound of my voice when I watch it. But further videos in this playlist will also be about movies that either aren't as bad as most people say, aren't as good as most people would have you believe, or just have had a mixed reception overall. These videos come out more slowly than my other content, just because they take longer to make, and I appreciate your patience. Ones I have in the lineup right now are Thor Ragnarok, Rogue One, and Hardcore Henry, but let me know what you'd like to see if anything fits the bill. If you've stuck around this long, then I want to thank you for watching, and leave a like if you're so inclined, and subscribe to see more. And may you all have a weapon in each hand.